Thank you for this conference. My presentation will be a little bit in the continuity of the previous one, because I will also speak about really the practice, not of teaching, but more of research and how we can go to the geographical consideration through this very practical question of teaching and research. And I've added the word discontinuity, and because I was not sure that the subtitle was very clear. And so this notion of discontinuity is really the main problem I want to discuss with you. So for this talk, I will speak about this project I am beginning for 2 years, 2 year. And so I don't have a beautiful case study to present. I don't have a theory to about geography of art. I have more question and desires, wishes, and real question, real hesitation to present. And that's a little bit what I understand with theory. I was wondering what is expected with the title of the conference, theorizing. I don't know the title. Theorizing Eastern European art, and maybe it's also a topic we can discuss. What do we hear with theory? I think that in every language it has different meanings, and I don't know what theory means, but for me, it was an invitation to a reflexive contribution to how do we do with spaces? How do art historians gather spaces, and what do they do with this geographical frame? So I will insist on that, on this geographical dimension for my project. The project, you see, is entitled, and you said it, Visual and Architectural History of the Underprivileged Classes. Sometimes I said subaltern groups in Eastern and Western Europe from the late 40s to the late 70s. And just to sum up very briefly, it is focused less on the production made for the underprivileged classes than the production made by the underprivileged classes. So it takes seriously the ambition and the politics, the initiatives to let people, and people can mean a lot of things, create images and create architecture also. So that means concretely that what I am working with, my material, is for images, amateur art, folk art. It is also handmade propaganda. It is, and very interesting for me, industrial and technical drawings, and amateur photography. That's the four groups of images: amateur art, handmade propaganda, technical drawings, and amateur photography. That's for the images. And for the architecture, it's the self-made building. Buildings that are totally created from people who are not architectural engineers, without the help of an architect. So that's the vernacular, informal architecture that I think is very, very important from this period, and which is a little bit neglected by the historiography. I give you just a few examples of what I found so far. And I didn't precise what I will discuss. I'm working in three contexts, 3 countries: Italy, Belgium, and USSR, not all USSR, but the Russian Soviet Republic, so the Russian part of USSR. So for instance, in Italy, I won't describe everything, but you see the kind of building and the kind of images that I'm working with. That's for Italy, about Belgium too, and about the Russian Soviet Republic. The image is from Magnitogorsk. That's the big city created in the 30s. And what I'm working with is in the 50s and 60s, the Association of Architects, the Soviet Association of Architects, observes that in Magnitogorsk you have a lot of self-made buildings, and so they write a lot about that. And I think there was something to do about these new towns, which didn't like exactly the images, the photography that we know, but they were in reality quite different through this reappropriation and through this informal architecture. So my preoccupation is also to make case studies for several contexts and to study the composition of the population and that's an history of the working class through images and through architecture. I don't develop some points like what does unprivileged classes mean, what are the boundaries between image made for this group and the image made by this group, and I focus on the geographical frame. About the geographical matter, we can say first that the first and the most important matter for me is a local one, because I work with case study on a very local level, in a neighborhood, in a small town, in a village, in a factory. So in order to investigate these situations and in order to understand what groups exactly are present here. So I want to stay on what we can say in English at the grassroots levels, very down-to-earth approach. So it's not very problematic. This choice is not very problematic. The most problematic choice, the geographical choice, is the different places of this situation I've chosen. You see, I've just pointed the main case studies I'm working with. They are located in 3 territories, let's call them territories. The Walloon part of Belgium, so not whole Belgium, but just the Walloon part. The different parts of Italy, Mezzogiorno, the center and the north, and some parts of the Russian Soviet Republic. So both in the European part, western the Urals, and in the eastern part of Russian Soviet Republic, east the Urals. I worked notably in the region of Irkutsk, Bratsk, and some other small town in Siberia. Why have I chosen this frame, and what is the overall coherence of this? So I consider places that were separated by the Iron Curtain, obviously, so by the frontier between Western Europe, liberal capitalist regimes, and the state socialist regimes. More than that, I consider places that are very distant from each other. They are not close neighbors. It is true for Belgium and Italy, which are not close neighbors, but it is especially true for Italy, Belgium, and the Russian Soviet Republic and its Siberian part. There were exchanges between this different context, and the communist organizations or communist-related organizations supervised circulations. For instance, in the Italian archives of the Federbraccianti, the Rural Workers' Union, I found this anonymous sculpture made out of wood. That's a reproduction of famous painting by Guttuso, a painting which was very present in Eastern Europe, in the popular democracies, because it was purchased by East Germany, and you have some other version that were purchased by other popular democracies, notably Hungary. We could develop what is the analysis of this object, which is very interesting. It is interesting to see how the choice of the material, the wood, reveals one feature, one very important feature of the original painting. This this way of separating form from each other. Of course, this kind of object, if I find some of them, they are very interesting for me, but they won't constitute the heart of the project. Exchanges were actually not as important or as frequent as I can hope. The circulation of objects, the presence of foreigners or references to abroad were just, they were rare elements, and I don't want to overestimate the importance of exchanges. And I think that's one point for the geography of art, of our practice, about this history of connection, circulation. We are all very interested by the circulation, but we all know that what circulates is only a small part of the experience. And if we focus, when we focus just on that, we miss something, and we make the experience poor. Another point is, as I work with subaltern groups, underprivileged classes, the question of circulation is a little bit different as if I would work with professional artists, intellectuals, or critics. I don't want to say that subaltern groups didn't move or that they were more isolated than other groups, but the modalities of migration, of circulation, were quite different, and it was rare that they went abroad for pure cultural purposes. It was more during delegations, and so it was related with economic collaboration, and so it's a little bit a different geography than the geography of professional artists, intellectual, and critics. But the main point for me is that situations are therefore, these situations, they are therefore badly connected to each other. That's this geographical frame is in large part artificial. I, as a researcher, I bring together these places, I bring them closer, and practically I hold them closer. And I find it interesting as a researcher to deal with this question, what do we do when we put places together? And it is, I have to ask myself this question because the geographical frame I have chosen is artificial, again, and I make the bet that it will produce something with when I will write a simultaneous history of this different group. And I hope to share that this different group in each context shared common preoccupations. This feeling of creating something artificial, we don't have it when we work on one country. I didn't have it when I made my PhD on the GDR. I was working on East Germany, and what I said is, like most of us, I said there are differences inside East Germany. There are differences between East Berlin, Leipzig, Dresden, and Karl-Marx-Stadt, and also smaller town. So when we have a national context, it doesn't seem to us artificial. We are used to it, and we take it for granted. I think it's the same when we consider usual spaces like Western Europe or Eastern Europe. We say there are differences between Warsaw, Prague, Bratislava, Bucharest, but it doesn't bother us to circulate inside these spaces. Maybe I could say the same with the colonial frame, because there are also this sense of continuity in the colonial context. It's more, but that is reassuring, but that is maybe a little bit misleading, and that is exactly why I wanted to choose something else, to break this feeling of continuity, and I wanted to have a space that is not homogeneous, and so it's not really just it's not about diversity and just to say, oh yes, it's very diverse. It's more than that. It's really to have discontinuous space And that is my interrogation as I'm moving forward in this project. What do I do with this idea of discontinuity? Because I want for the project to consider species that had nothing to do with each other, or at least that has little to do with each other. It's not really about comparison. It's because it's really the idea of working simultaneously with different contexts, and to work also on the idea that you mentioned in the previous presentation of contemporaneity, in the sense that they happened at the same time. And I love this work of contemporaneity because in every language you find it, and it was a very, very important word also in the critics at the socialist time. And you have a lot of discussion, especially in the late 50s and early 60s, on the notion of contemporaneity. What does it mean that things happen at the same time, artistic, visual, architectural form happen at the same time, even if they are not directly connected. So it's about considering simultaneously spaces that are fragmented and artificially related without being totally isolated. The last point I want to present is the question of the European dimension. That's also a question for me, because you see, I stretch Europe until Siberia, and of course it is an interrogation of what is Europe. Belgium and Italy are obviously in Europe; they are founding members of the European Union. For Italy, with Sicily, it's more complicated. With European, does Sicily belong to Europe is complicated. But of course, it's the real question is again about Russian Soviet Republic, and I find different discourses and point of views. Okay, I will show that. Yeah, different discourses and point of views about this idea of belonging to Europe. From the point of view of popular democracies in the Eastern Europe, Russia very often did not belong to Europe. Poland belonged to Europe, but not Russia. That's the frontier. If you ask specialists of Soviet Union, they said that the part of USSR that belonged to Europe was Baltic states. That was the most European part of the USSR and not the Russian part. But if you adopt the point of view of people from Central Asia, from Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, they called people from Siberia, Russian people from Siberia, they called them a European. And you find in the text this European denomination for Irkutsk, for Bratsk, and it is we can understand why most of the Siberian towns were constructed on European models, and they were populated mostly, not exclusively, but mostly by people coming from Europe, or at least Ukraine and the European part of Russia. So I'm interested with Siberia because it is neither clearly European nor extra-European. It's not like Asia or Africa. It is incidentally European. And I think it's a very good way to question this idea of Europe, an original way of questioning it. I will maybe finish with a map. I am searching a map which will be different from this one. That's the usual way we represent the space I'm working with. You have either Eastern Europe and Western Europe, and the European part of Russia. And on the other hand, you have the map of USSR with a different republic. I haven't found yet one single map from Western Europe to Vladivostok. I hope I will find it, and it will be a way to deform Europe and to misrepresent Europe, and I find it interesting. Is it my research about Eastern Europe? It will be very, very provocative to say that Siberia is part of Eastern Europe, but it can also be a way of questioning what what can appear as obvious, this idea of Eastern Europe. And I finish with this map that I found in the Belgian archives. That's a book for the Turkish, Greek, Spanish, Portuguese, Moroccan, Algerian workers who come to Belgium with the agreements in the 50s and 60s. And I find it really interesting that also the opposition between the two maps, the national territory is very good represented and it's very accurate, and you have every part of Belgium. But if you see the European map, it was probably done very quickly. You have just Algeria and Morocco, you don't have Tunisia. And what I find interesting also is the representation of Eastern Europe. You have some frontiers, you see Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, but you don't see the difference between East Germany, Poland, and USSR. It's just one territory, a perfect Molotov-Ribbentrop representation. And you don't have at all the frontier of USSR. It's like a no space in this representation. Thank you.